Hey, this is Rob Cubbon from robcubbon.com here, and I'm going to show you how to start a podcast. I have to say, if you wanted to start a podcast, the first thing you should probably do is to Google Pat Flynn how to start a podcasting tutorial, or go to smartpassiveincome.com and search for podcast tutorial, because Pat Flynn has the ultimate guide to starting a podcast here. And there's about 5 videos, I think, amounting to about an hour's worth of video viewing. So what I'm going to do now is a video that hopefully only lasts for about 10 minutes that will tell you all you need to know about starting a podcast. But if you want it in large detail, then I'd definitely advise you to go here. 3 things you need to start a podcast. First of all is an idea. Here I've got a new site called Genuine Hypnosis, which is about hypnosis, NLP, self-help and happiness. And I'm going to start a podcast from this. So you need an idea and you need some keywords. So I've got my keywords like NLP, life coach, etc. And you might want to do a bit of keyword research on that as well. So first of all, an idea is very important. Secondly, you're going to need a podcast. And there is my first podcast. It's an MP3 file. I'll show you how I made that in GarageBand. Obviously, I've interviewed someone, and here is the interview there. I did this with Call Recorder for Skype. So there's the interview. And before the interview, I have a little bit of talking, then some music, which then gets faded down. As you can see, that's faded down to nothing, that music. And then the interview kicks in. And then at the end, bit more talking from me, and then another bit of music for the outro. And once I'd finished that, I go export song to disk and export it as an MP3. And here that is. The third thing you need is an image. And here is my image. I did it at 1400 pixels. After you've done it at 1400 pixels, you then need to change the image size to 300 pixels and save it out like that. So when you're finished, you have a ping of 1400 by 1400 and a ping of 300 by 300. Just a quick note about these icons for podcasts. Here's one I did earlier, very bad. Now the moral of the story is you've got to keep it simple. This is something I wanted: the title, I wanted my image, I wanted my logo. It was just too much and I just couldn't get it to work, even though I tried really hard over a long period of time. And then this one took me 5 seconds, and I think it works much better. So here is iTunes, and you can see down the left here how these square icons work for the various podcast episodes. You make your own mind up about which ones are best. I think Chris Ducker's got a really good one here. There's Pat Flynn. So there's the podcast. So now we have to take this into iTunes to change the file format to AIFF, to put it through Levelator, so we level out all the volumes, change it back into an MP3, and then finally set the ID tags and add the image. I'm going to go into music. I have a playlist called Podcasts where I keep all my podcasts, and I'm just going to drag the MP3 over into my iTunes. So first of all, you do iTunes preferences, change the import settings to AIFF, and then if you right click, you can create an AIFF version. And once that's done, you need to find it. And in order to do that, you just go into songs. And you can find out which one it is by doing Control-I. That's the MPEG, so this will be the AIFF. So that's the one you want to put into Levelator. So that's copied, and we put it into Levelator. So when Levelator is finished, you will find another file hanging around in the same place as the original AIFF, which has .output before the AIF, and that is your leveled file. So you need to put that one back into iTunes and change it into an MP3. So let's go back into playlists and podcasts and put that one in. And then we need to go back into preferences, import settings, and change that back into MP3. And then we need to create an MP3 of that version. And that's done. We need to go back into songs, and we should find it here. Of course, it's one of those two. And it's that one, the more recent one. the MPEG version. So that's the one. So we'll get rid of these two, and that's the one we want. So this is the one that we put all our ID tags on. And to do that, it's Command I or get info again. And you only need to bother with this tab and this tab. So this is all very important. It's where you need to stuff your keywords. Well, when I say stuff, I don't mean stuff, of course, that you know what I mean. Here is the name. I'm giving it the name GHP, so it's Genuine Hypnosis Podcast. It's number 1. That's like my file number. And then I've got the title, which is the same as the title of the blog post that's going out with the podcast. So I've got keywords in there, and it explains what's happening in the podcast, which is a live coaching session where someone performs NLP therapy on yours truly, and it's very interesting, so I do advise you to give it a listen. Little plug there. So the artist, which is me, goes in there. Again, I've got keywords in there and there as well. And for the album and grouping, I put keyword filled phrase about the Genuine Hypnosis Podcast. And then comments, we put about 150 word synopsis of the blog post or the podcast in there as well. And there are my comments. And in genre, we do a P for podcast. And that's the info finished. Now for the artwork, you go add, and then you find the larger of the two square icons that you created. And there's mine. And that's it. Just okay that. And that is your podcast. Now ready to upload. Okay, so you've done your first podcast and you need to put it somewhere in order for it to be read by all the feed readers, and it's generally considered to be a bad idea to put it on your own server. You need to put it on some specialist server in the same way as you put videos on YouTube. Unfortunately, unlike YouTube, this is not free, and the one that everyone recommends is Libsyn. That's libsyn.com, and it's about $15 a month. Apparently all the others, Amazon S3 isn't right for podcasting, and it's just got to be Libsyn. All you need to do is upload that file here. So you just go to publish, and then you choose I want to publish a file for download only, and you click on hard drive to upload it. You select it, and then you click publish, and then that will upload. It'll take a bit of time, 10 minutes for 40 meg. Okay, so that's uploaded, and what you need to do now is just copy that link. That is your download link, and you're finished with Libsyn now. You don't need to come back. You've got your download link. You just copy that and you're gone. So the next thing you need to do is to install the podcast plugin. And the podcast plugin is called Bluberry Powerpress. So let's do a search for Powerpress, all one word. There it is. Bluberry Powerpress, all one word, podcasting plugin. Install now and activate. Okay, so you just go into Powerpress and then basic settings. Basically, this is what you need to do. These first two here you want checked, and have custom podcast channels down here checked as well. Save changes on that. Services and stats you don't need to bother about now. Media appearance. Here you can decide where you want the podcast player to display on the blog post that you've created your podcast on. And I like it above page content so people can click play as soon as they've loaded the page. Also here you want to display the player, and I like to be able to display the player in a new window, which is really handy for people who just want to listen to the podcast and navigate off the website. And I like to display a download link as well for people who just want to download the MP3, take it somewhere with them and listen to it at a later date. That's what we need on that one. Save changes. And then feeds. This is a really important one. Here we have our feed. It's not validated yet because I haven't created a podcast episode yet, but I will do in one moment. But this is where we create our feed, which will be the website name.com/feed/podcast. But in the feed settings, you might want to show the recent 50 episodes. That's not going to mean much until I've recorded more than 10, and I haven't recorded one yet. The default is only 10. The Rss To Image, this is the smaller image version of the podcast image that I showed you earlier. So what you need to do is to upload that smaller one, which was 300 by 300 pixels, upload that somewhere on your site and put in the address of it here. So here is the website, and we'll create a new directory and call it podcast, and let's put our small icon in there. So that's where we put the image, in podcast and the file name. And if you click preview there, it'll open a new window so you can check it's live. And then all we've got to do is copyright and the location and the frequency and save changes. So on the iTunes tab of the Powerpress settings, you want to give this a miss now because you don't have an iTunes subscription URL yet, because we haven't published the podcast yet. So we'll come back to that one later. So here we have the iTunes feed settings, and we want program keywords. So I'll put some keywords in there. We'll go for categories, health, self-help. We can choose 3 categories. So my other 2 are going to be religion, spirituality, and the third one, health, alternative health. iTunes explicit, here is where you say clean, no explicit content. And here you've got to put in a URL of your 1400 by 1400 pixel image. So we're going to have to upload that one as well. So I'll put that one in there as well. And preview that, and there's our big image. And then in the talent name, we can put our name and the keywords as well. Remember that we put on the ID tags, and email, and save changes. And then finally, because in the basic settings we checked custom podcast channels, we have a custom podcast channel here, and here if we edit it, we can override the feed title, which otherwise would be just Genuine Hypnosis, but it's a little point here, we can call it the Genuine Hypnosis Happiness Podcast. Get another keyword in there. Save changes. And that is all your Powerpress settings done. And now all you have to do is publish that damn podcast. It's taken a while, but we got to this stage. Here is my preview of my blog post, that is the blog post that contains my first podcast. It doesn't have it yet. This is actually a YouTube video of the interview I did. I very much advise you to do a video if you can. Call Recorder for Skype does video and audio, and you actually get to see the people's face, and I do think this is really important. Just as the podcast is important that people hear your voice, video is important that people see your face and the face of the interviewee as well. So all that is a WordPress post, and here it is in the back end. It's saved as a draft so far. And if you go right down to the bottom, because we have the Powerpress podcast plugin installed, here is a custom field at the bottom saying podcast episode, and you need to put that URL in from Libsyn that we had earlier. Now, I've actually logged out of Libsyn and had to log back in again, so I can show you where to get the link from if you haven't got it straight away. So you just go publish, and then previous posts, there it is, and you click on links, and it's this first one here. So you copy that and put it in there, press verify, media verified successfully, fantastic. You're about to publish your first podcast now, so you just go publish, and now if you go back to your site, you have the new podcast episode, and if you click on it, right at the top there is the podcast. You can play it in a new window, or you can download. Hello and welcome to the. Or you can download it, or you can play it on the site. But that is it. The podcast is now published. And now, just to check it's working, we can go back into PowerPress settings, and under feeds, there is our feed. Let's validate it. Congratulations, this is a valid RSS feed. So, looks like we've done it. So next up, we're actually going to submit the feed to iTunes. So we go back into PowerPress settings, and we'll copy that link. That's the link for our podcast feed, and go into iTunes. And in the iTunes store, you should click on podcasts, and down here on the right is submit a podcast. And in there you paste the feed URL that you just copied in the Bluberry settings. Continue. And as you can see, you needed an Apple ID for that. And there is all the details of my new podcast. So we submit that, and the last time I did this, I got my email back from Apple within 24 hours, so we'll see how long that takes this time. It shouldn't take too long. Chris Ducker says that you actually have an 8-week window where you get listed on the iTunes new and noteworthy section. So it's a good idea to pack in your podcasts in the first few weeks. I certainly had 3 podcasts ready before I started my other one, and I've got 3 podcasts ready now for this one. So I would advise you to have lots of podcasts up your sleeve, especially when you're interviewing people, because people tend to cancel and everything. Also, Pat Flynn recommends that you don't do it at this stage. You should maybe wait till you've recorded 4 or 5 podcasts, so people don't see a podcast with just 1 episode in it. But I'm doing it straight away, so I've submitted to iTunes. Next up, you should submit to a couple of others, and I'll give the links underneath this video on my site. Also on Pat Flynn's podcast tutorial, and they are Stitcher and Blackberry. And also there's an email address for one that you send to Zune. I really think that iTunes is the most important one, and we'll see how we get on. Okay, so I've received my email from iTunes, my iTunes store approval. It's come early on Monday and I applied late on Thursday, so more like 4 days. That's longer than I experienced last time, but that included a weekend. So there is our link to our iTunes podcast. And there's one thing I'm not happy with here. Our description for the podcast is just another WordPress site. So we're going to look into that. Don't worry, that you can change anything, any of the details of settings in Powerpress, and the feed will get updated within a few days. But I'm delighted to see my podcast there. View it in iTunes, and there it is. If you want to leave a review, by the way, this is where you go. Just a little hint there. And this is where you can subscribe, of course. So I'm really happy about that. So if we go back to the Powerpress settings, under iTunes, we can now put in our iTunes subscription URL, which is that one there in the email, and the address of the podcast at the iTunes website. Save changes. And you can see in the advanced options there, remember we checked custom podcast channels. And this gives us our podcast channel here under Powerpress, and here we can edit the podcast, and here we can enter a feed description. So this will overwrite that terrible generic just another WordPress blog description that I've got in there. And there's my description, so I'll update that. So thank you very much for listening. That was more like 15 minutes than 5 or 10 minutes, as I said at the beginning, so I'm sorry about that, but it is a quite involved process. I hope you found out enough about starting a podcast, and if you do get to start a podcast, I really hope you enjoy it. Drop me a line, tell me what you thought about this video, and drop me a link to your podcast, and I'll give it a listen. Again, if you want to listen about starting a podcast in much more detail, with many more minutes of videos, just head over to smartpassiveincome.com, how to start a podcasting tutorial by Pat Flynn, because that is more or less the authority post on how to start a podcast. Okay, my name is Rob Cubbon from robcubbon.com. I hope you enjoyed that. Goodbye.